Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are here this afternoon to have a panel discussion on evidence-based action through multi-stakeholder partnerships, the case of Honduras. And as you will have seen from the summary description of this panel, it's really a discussion about the importance of collaboration in getting things done and the real necessity to have robust evidence and analysis to enable that collaboration and to get results. So we only have an hour for this really important discussion. So first I'd like to launch into some very quick introductions of our panelists so you'll know who is with us today. I'll ask our panelists to wave to their camera when I'm talking about them. First up, we have Nathan Martinez, who is the lead for the economics team in the Center for Economics and Market Development at USAID. His work is centered on cost-benefit analysis, performance evaluations, and inclusive growth diagnostics. Most recently, he led an inclusive growth diagnostic for Honduras. Next up, we have Catherine Klass, who is the program manager for the Inter-American Dialogue's Migration, Remittances, and Development Program. Next is Ricardo Matamoros, who is the director of the Institute for Economic and Social Research at the National Autonomous University of Honduras. And fourth, but certainly not least, we have Dunn Grover, who is the Deputy Chief of Party for the USAID Honduras Transforming Market Systems activity, for which ACDI VOCA is the prime implementing partner. So with those introductions complete, I'd like to start the conversation. Again, we have only an hour and this is a big topic, so we need to get stuck into it right away. Nathan, from the donor's perspective, in your experience, what is the role of data and evidence in influencing decisions and how important is it for donors?
Well, thank you. So the world is constantly evolving, providing new challenges and opportunities for partner countries, donors, and other actors. To help address these issues and to stay focused, USAID has outlined its commitments to sustainability, cost effectiveness, and inclusivity in its new EG approach. A big part of this approach is finding new ways of using data, evidence, and innovation to solve complex problems. And while we understand that decision makers use a diverse set of inputs when making strategic and programmatic decisions, we believe it is absolutely critical that donors and other partners use data and evidence when choosing the best path for moving forward. To help prioritize problems, this helps to help prioritize problems. It helps to identify what may work and what doesn't work. It helps to identify where there may be some information gaps, and then you can figure out how to solve those information gaps. And finally, it helps to measure the cost effectiveness of development activities, which we all know is critical given budget constraints. The analytic process includes the development of a research design that identifies primary and secondary research questions that we would like to address. It also includes the methodology that will be used to address these questions and the data or information requirements. What we have found, at least during my time with USAID, is that the recipe for a successful research project includes a clearly defined and focused research question, a structured methodology, and plan for capturing information that includes partners with local contexts and networks, and the identification of specific data requirements or other information that needs to be captured. What our team has also found that while it is crucial to formulate a focused research plan and to hone in on a methodology, we usually have a lot of control over this process and the decisions that are made there. This is not necessarily the case with data and information gaps. This is a problem because we lack information about the people and problems we would like to impact. We cannot accurately measure the costs or outcomes, and we have no idea if our interventions will endure after our project ends. Recognizing this, we're focusing on several new initiatives that we hope increases the availability and use of data and evidence. We're partnering with the UC Berkeley's Development Impact Lab, or DIL, on two efforts. This includes working with USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance to develop rigorous costing guidance, tools, and training for implementing partners and USAID staff. This new data will be incorporated into impact evaluations and cost-benefit analysis to measure the value for money for USAID's investments. It also includes the use of publicly available geospatial images and machine learning algorithms to predict what is happening in situations where there's an absence of data. This tool will be provided as a public good for researchers and implementing partners and others, and is currently being piloted in several USAID studies. We're also making new efforts to collect primary data to supplement national and international data sets. For example, when starting our remittances research for Honduras, we knew pretty quickly that we didn't have the data on Hondurans' appetite and technological readiness to use digital payments. In response, USAID TMS, USAID Washington, and the Inter-American Dialogue partnered on a survey to capture this information. The findings from the study will be used to make programmatic decisions at USAID. We also are supporting primary survey data collection in West Africa and other parts of Latin America to improve our research and provide evidence-based information to decision makers and others. Finally, we were seeking new ways to incorporate behavioral economics into our research and our programming. This means finding ways to incorporate preferences, beliefs, and decision-making to everything we do. An example of this is we're piloting a training project that identifies how social preferences and social norms can be incorporated into USAID's program cycle. And then one last thing is that we are taking a more concentrated approach to partnering with implementing partners, local academic institutions, NGOs, and others to collect data and evidence and to conduct analyses. And part of this was brought on by the pandemic. So we're adjusting that as well. And this is one of the reasons that I'm here speaking to you today. And thank you. That concludes my response to the first question.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. That's an interesting perspective from the donor's point of view. Moving on to the perspective of research institutions, let's bring in Catherine. Catherine, in your experience, what are the benefits you have seen in engaging local institutions in the research process? How has that engagement resulted in better outcomes in terms of influencing decision making? I think you're muted, Catherine.
Thank you twice, CJ. Thank you to ACI Boca as well for the invitation to join the panel and talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing with the TMS team in Honduras and also Nathan's team at USAID. And I think that the initiative that Nathan mentioned in his answer is actually a prime example for me to share about how engaging local organizations in research can benefit decision-making, whether it be in terms of programming, policy making, budget allocation, but processes that seek to better development outcomes. So before I go into the three main benefits that I think that this experience can teach us, I wanted to describe that research process just a little bit so that you can kind of imagine along with me as I'm going through those benefits. The research process is looking to understand, from our perspective, the relationship between remittances that Honduran families and communities receive and economic opportunities in the country, and the very nuanced relationship between that income and the opportunities that it creates economically for families, as well as how all of that relates to their ability or interest in staying close to home or migrating elsewhere. With that research question in mind, we came up collectively with a mixed methods approach, which involves key informant interviews with experts outside of Honduras, experts inside Honduras with Hondurans, and a literature review. And then based on all of that information that was generated and collected and systematized, going on the ground to talk to remittance recipients and their families in Honduras through survey work to kind of fill some of those gaps and answer some of those questions that the conversations we were having generated, and better understand specifically how remittances relate to financial inclusion, some of the questions that Nathan was asking, digital access, income, labor market participation, impacts of the pandemic, et cetera. And then once we have all of that information kind of processed and analyzed, put together an assessment that's actionable and that not only presents evidence and data that's useful for stakeholders, but also a list of recommendations for them to follow towards the types of development outcomes that are at the start of the research project from the get-go. So in that process, we're about 3/4 of the way through. We just finished the field work, and I can say that there's 3 main benefits as far as the involvement of local organizations in the process. The first is that they're very important entities for identifying locally relevant research questions and priorities. The second is their importance for defining methodologies that are feasible and that produce the quality of information that's desired. And the third is to helping close the disconnect that we often see between research and action, or research and decisions based on evidence. So to start with the first one, I would say that, considerable relevance, local organizations we know have considerable relevance and in identifying potential gaps between the realities that they're seeing and programming or policy solutions. And from there, based on that, what ACDI VOCA showed when they came forward with this research question was that they also have very important agency in defining a research question and developing a research agenda, putting feet to that agenda in order to answer the questions that are coming up for them so that they can improve the outcomes that they're contributing to on the ground. Once these sort of information gaps or questions are laid out there, and ACDI VOCA or other local actors have got things going with a research institution like ourselves, like USAID, that's also been involved. They're also very important for helping to define research methods that are feasible, especially when we're looking to do on the ground research. So, they have a lot of insight to offer in terms of, whether to proceed with surveys, how to proceed with them, what is a viable sample based on what's happening. ACDI VOCA was absolutely critical in the survey that we did with remittance recipients just before an election in Honduras, which can be a sort of tricky time to be doing field work, but also because of the relationships that they have in those circumstances to be able to form a partnership with financial institutions and other places where our surveyors could conduct field work safely and effectively. That would have been much more challenging to do, from another level out. And putting them in the driver's seat of coordinating the qualitative research as well, reaching out to key informants, can also leverage, allows us to leverage that ability and the contacts that they have to engage a diverse set of stakeholders who are going to have, technical level information that we're looking to gather. And then finally, the third point that I wanted to mention in this experience that we've had most recently in Honduras is that when we involve local organizations in research, it facilitates a pathway towards evidence-based policymaking and decision-making, which just takes us one step closer to a community-driven solution to the development outcomes that lead us to the research in the first place. So to close, I wanted to just mention a few things there. We do that involving them in the process, and the way that pathway is kind of built, that bridge is built, is because they inherently engage 2 sets of stakeholders from the outset of the research process. The first is the target audience, or the end user, which in this case, an example is USAID or other perhaps multilateral organizations, as well as peer organizations and actors that are involved in the research as perhaps informants or interviewees, but that are also going to be important in generating momentum after the research is done around a certain policy or decision or strategy that kind of comes out in the recommendations. When, this takes us to the decision making, because when we involve those decision makers from the very beginning in the design phase, help to set priorities and generate data that's going to be relevant for them, but it also encourages buy-in from the get-go, a sense of ownership of the outcome of what we're moving towards, of finding an answer based on all the effort we're putting into developing information. And having peer organizations involved, that interaction between the local organization, the camaraderie, the repertoire that kind of gets built in as they're coordinating, learning about the research, but also coordinating the interviews and all of that after the fact with nonprofits, financial sector, people from the private sector, that can help build that momentum that I mentioned after the research is finished around certain solutions. So those are the three that I wanted to share for today, and I'll pass it back to you, CJ, or for other questions at the end of the panel.
Great. Thanks very much, Catherine. Having heard now the perspectives of both donors and research institutions, let's turn to academia. I'd like to get a perspective from a Honduran university that is trying to answer some of these tough questions facing the region. Ricardo, can you tell us what has been the National University's experience generating applied research for policymakers and to inform investments in development initiatives?
Claro, Charles. Hola y mucho gusto. Gracias a Abdi Boca por la invitación a este importante panel. En Honduras, al igual que en Centroamérica y en el resto del mundo, hay un dilema, ¿no? Una discusión entre cómo el mundo académico puede ser más práctico y cómo puede ser más relevante, cómo aporta soluciones a los problemas. En el caso de Honduras y de Centroamérica ha sido particularmente más fuerte esta necesidad, ¿no? Suele verse, tanto por el sector privado como el sector público, que la comunidad académica, en primer lugar, con los problemas que tiene en términos de recursos limitados, de fondos, para poder llevar a cabo la investigación, son muy escasos. Todos se orientan hacia la parte docente. Luego, estos problemas de que cuando hay algún tipo de investigación, los resultados de estas investigaciones suelen publicarse 2 o hasta 3 años después de que han ocurrido los hechos. Ya para los tomadores de decisiones, eso es muy, ya no es relevante, ¿no? Y también el otro problema que suele ocurrir es que muchas de las publicaciones, cuando se hace esta investigación, es publicada en formatos y en un lenguaje demasiado complejo para el lector medio, para el empresario o para el público en general, los medios de comunicación. Esto profundiza en Honduras esta desconexión o este divorcio entre el mundo académico y lo que hace la sociedad. Hablando del respecto a tu pregunta, en primer lugar, ¿cómo hemos trabajado en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma este tema? Tratando de reconectarnos un poco en la línea de lo que mencionó Nathan. Para eso es necesario elegir preguntas de investigación que sean relevantes no solamente para el mundo académico, sino en este caso para el resto de los actores, para Honduras, para la sociedad y principalmente para los tomadores y responsables de tomar decisiones, ¿no? En ese sentido, entonces, esa necesidad de comprender los problemas prácticos, de poder analizar, de poder ofrecer soluciones empresariales, ha sido lo primero que nos llamó la atención. Y lo primero que hicimos y hemos hecho es entonces, a través de esta alianza, primero con Abdi Boca y luego acercarnos al sector empresarial, al Consejo Hondureño de la Empresa Privada, a las cámaras de comercio de todo el país, de diversas regiones del país, para poder escucharlos, ¿no? Para poder conocer cuáles son sus problemas, sus dificultades y hacerles entender que nosotros no solamente les queremos estudiar, analizar e informar, sino que más bien queremos entregar evidencia ¿no? A partir de estas capacidades que tenemos, con esta rigurosidad del proceso científico, poder entregarles evidencias que sean de utilidad para ellos. Esta reconexión a través del diálogo, a través de la conversación, una conversación genuina, horizontal, nos llevó a la creación de alianzas. Y alianzas no desde el punto de vista tradicional, que por lo general, por lo menos en nuestro país, cuando pensamos en alianzas, suelen estar rodeadas de mucho protocolo, suelen tener una capacidad de respuesta muy lenta, ¿no? Y de acción muy lenta. Pues pensamos en un tipo de alianzas con una mayor capacidad de respuesta que nos permitió, en el marco, por ejemplo, de COVID-19, con 20 cámaras de comercio del país, con el apoyo técnico de Activoca, con el Consejo Hondureño de la Empresa Privada, pudimos desarrollar 3 investigaciones de manera virtual en tiempo récord, aliándonos, aprovechando las capacidades, los recursos financieros, técnicos, humanos, logísticos que cada uno de los actores tenía, aportarlos a la alianza. En el caso de la universidad, nosotros aportar especialistas en análisis de datos, en investigación, aprovechando nuestras oficinas regionales para poder aportar evidencia y desarrollar actividades de investigación que en un esquema normal, en tiempos normales, nos hubiese tardado 6 meses para hacer cada investigación. Nosotros en un periodo de más o menos 6-7 meses hicimos 3 investigaciones. En ese sentido, ¿y a qué nos llevó esto? También nos llevó como universidad a repensar, ¿no?, nuestro esquema interno de trabajo, nuestro modo y nuestro modelo de trabajar. Eso nos llevó, por ejemplo, a identificar investigadores en nuestros diferentes campus afiliados en todo Honduras. La Universidad Nacional tiene 8 centros en las 8 ciudades más importantes del país y más pobladas, que estábamos desconectados, que nos comunicábamos tal vez a veces muy esporádicamente. Ahora, a partir de la virtualidad, tenemos una red de más de 23 investigadores diseminados por todo el país sin tener que nosotros movilizarnos allá, y tenemos capacidades de investigación, por ejemplo, allí. Hemos creado esta red que nos permite entonces tener presencia al mismo tiempo y con una fracción de costos hacer este tipo de iniciativas. Esto nos ha permitido también, hemos trabajado junto al apoyo de Activoca, por ejemplo, en la generación de un sistema de información, una plataforma virtual con política de libre acceso a las bases de datos comunes. Estos datos con protocolos para guardar confidencialidad, datos que van a poder servir de libre acceso a todos los socios y a toda la comunidad, que ese es otro gran problema que tenemos en Honduras. Y esto es producto de la alianza, ¿no?, de la necesidad de decir, no deberían de tener la información todos, solo alguien, sino que todos deberían de tener libre acceso en ese sentido. Esto nos ha permitido una gran flexibilidad, nos ha permitido acelerar, por ejemplo, la forma en cómo podemos incidir. El año pasado, producto de estos datos generados del impacto de la pandemia en el sector empresarial, pudimos presentar al más alto nivel estos resultados, y esto incidió en la ampliación y la aprobación, por ejemplo, de la ley de auxilio al sector productivo y a los trabajadores que estaban siendo afectados por la pandemia, y también permitió ampliar los beneficios a la micro, pequeña y mediana empresa del país que también estaba siendo afectado. Todo a raíz de esta evidencia que el sector público, el resto del sector público no podía generar la evidencia, pero que esta alianza permitió poder entregar evidencia de lo que estaba ocurriendo.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you for that description, Ricardo. Before turning to Dunn to hear the perspective of the INGO community, let me follow up directly with you, Ricardo, on that, on your comments there, which are very interesting. Are you aware of this kind of engagement between academia and the public and private sectors happening in other countries in Central America at this point?
Sí, Charles. De hecho, esta misma experiencia de las encuestas de resiliencia empresarial en otro espacio de discusión, el Sistema de Integración Centroamericana, hubo una oportunidad en la cual nosotros pudimos compartir esta experiencia con otras universidades de la región de la región centroamericana. Nicaragua, la Universidad Autónoma de Nicaragua, con la Universidad de Costa Rica, con 2 universidades en República Dominicana. Les llamó la atención, les pareció interesante esa experiencia y hicimos varias reuniones de trabajo y en primer lugar lo que entendimos es que existen una serie de problemas en común. Si uno analiza en Centroamérica, es cierto, cada país tiene algunas particularidades, pero hay muchos de estos problemas que son muy comunes, ¿no? Y incluyendo los problemas de la academia, los que acabo de describir. Esto nos ayudó entonces a permitirnos pensar, ¿no?, en un tema de por qué no unimos esfuerzos. Si esto se puede hacer a nivel de un país, del sector privado y público de un país, ¿por qué no lo pudiésemos hacer y replicar, por ejemplo, en otros países de la región, teniendo estos problemas en común? Y luego entonces surgió la idea de cómo esto puede ser una oportunidad para la escalabilidad, ¿no? Así como creamos una economía de escala, digámoslo así, de la investigación a nivel de Honduras, esto perfectamente lo pudiésemos hacer a nivel de la región centroamericana, aprovechando las limitantes, ¿no? Las limitantes que nosotros teníamos. Esto nos llevó a presentar un proyecto de la creación de la red centroamericana de investigadores en economía y desarrollo, conformado por estas primeras 5 universidades. De hecho, pudimos acceder a algunos recursos, por ejemplo, de Capital Semilla para fortalecer esta alianza. Estamos creando una agenda común de trabajo y todo bajo este esquema de alianza, ¿no? Este esquema de alianza rompiendo nuestros esquemas anteriores, ¿no?, de trabajo. Esto nos ha permitido entonces identificar que perfectamente, obviamente en el mediano y largo plazo, podemos generar sinergias para la investigación aplicada en una dimensión fuerte, increíble y muy poderosa. Insisto en el tema del rol de cómo la academia puede repensarse, ¿no?, dentro de la región centroamericana. Y finalmente, para poder tener entonces abordajes regionales, ¿no? Y qué mejor espacio que este encuentro, ¿no?, centroamericano. Nos escucha gente de todo Centroamérica y la cooperación que está en Centroamérica. Hay ciertos problemas que en realidad podríamos pensar abordarlos de una manera regional. Y este tipo de modelos promete un gran potencial precisamente en términos, insisto, de escalabilidad y en términos de un uso eficiente de todos los esfuerzos financieros, logísticos, humanos y en términos de las capacidades que ya están en Centroamérica.
Great. Thank you very much. Before turning to Dunn, I just want to note that we have a couple of comments in the chat boxes. Tom Hare has put a link in there for another example of an agile, flexible, and economical alliance as well for academic investigation. So check that out. And Angela Madrid Lara is asking for interested parties to contact her for alliances as well. But just to round out our panel here, I'd like to ask Dunn to give us the perspective from the international NGO standpoint. The examples we've heard from Nathan, Catherine, and Ricardo imply a shift in how INGOs need to do business, really. Can you tell us exactly what this shift entails, Dunn?
Thank you, CJ. As others have mentioned, data and evidence play a key role in development. Data and evidence is used to justify interventions, to provide accountability, and to create knowledge and expertise for action and use. Historically, data and evidence that we've collected has been for our needs, the needs of INGOs and donors. This, however, has the consequence of pushing resources for research we think demands attention. This ultimately influences where donor investments and interventions are made. The transition that needs to happen is a shift to where Central American organizations are in charge of producing their own evidence, diagnosing their own problems, finding and implementing their own solutions, with INGOs and the donor community in a more supportive and collaborative role. Here are a couple of the changes we have been making in our program in Honduras to facilitate this shift. First is changing who decides the research questions. We have chosen as an activity to invest in research and evidence, not only to answer our data needs, and the needs of the donor, but to answer local organization needs as well. We accommodate this through an open co-creation process that allows local organizations to present their ideas or questions for investigation. Interestingly, we've seen a lot of research questions posed by the public and private sector in Honduras in the past year, such as what is the impact of COVID-19 on businesses? What policy areas should we prioritize to attract investment to Honduras? What is the impact of the tourism sector on the Honduran economy? How does the legal framework need to evolve to support the electronic payment system? What new markets should I pursue for my business, among many others? Second, we need to change how research is conducted. It may be more expedient to go with an established international research firm. Instead, as a project, we've started to actively invest in local organizations to build their capacity to be able to sustainably generate research and evidence needed to answer these questions. Ricardo spoke about the importance of strategic alliances, investing in information systems, and in supporting local research institutions to develop expertise in new methodologies. Interestingly, this has been an area of strong demand for us, whether supporting the National Autonomous University of Honduras to develop a research center for economic policy, or the National Council for Investment to develop a market intelligence units for agro-exporters, among others. Third, we need to change how data is interpreted. There is a myth, or at least a misunderstanding, that research is entirely objective or value-free. Though researchers may strive to reduce bias, we know that research is imperfect. Even if data were entirely objective, we know that that data will be interpreted by people based on their own values and beliefs. So we need to recognize the influence of values and diverse points of views and incorporate these as part of the analysis and interpretation of data and evidence. What is the right thing to do? Who gets to decide that? Are these the right people? These are the questions we need to be considering. Here are some practical ways that we've been addressing this aspect. One is making data and evidence as accessible as possible. If it takes a PhD to understand the inference, then you're creating a barrier for a large part of the population to engage meaningfully in this analysis stage. There are ways to improve the accessibility of data, whether through data visualizations, simple narratives, or other ways of communicating the evidence. Number two, a diversity of perspectives is critical to interpret data. We need meaningful dialogue that facilitates constructive conversation between persons who have diverse points of view. This is necessary to make sense and draw conclusions from the data. And number three, we need platforms for continued engagement and conversation. Many of the issues that we are researching are complex and require long-term development solutions. So dialogue and engagement needs to be continuous. This can be facilitated through working tables or other forms of continuous engagement where data and evidence is updated, discussed, and reflected on. The fourth and final change and observation I want to share is how data is used for action. The shared goal we all have here today is we recognize the need for a systems change to address issues like irregular migration, lack of jobs, corruption, and violence. These challenges require systemic solutions. To lead broader systems change requires that local leadership have the data and evidence that they need to provide the strategic direction and to mobilize coalitions to lead this change. Here's where I think that we've stumbled on a real leverage point to influence the system. For us to be able to realize this potential for change that already exists, we need to value and invest in local knowledge and data. And I think that is the most important lesson from the perspective of INGOs that I wanted to share with you today.
Great, thanks very much, Don. All of that is very interesting. So now we've heard the perspectives of donors, research institutions, academia, and international NGOs. I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any specific questions yet. So let me turn back to Nathan and ask you again from the donor perspective, based on your experience, what are some of the other benefits you see in partnering with local organizations to conduct and implement this type of collaborative applied research as opposed to doing it yourself?
Well, thank you, CJ. And thank you to the rest of the panelists. I think what I'll be describing now is just driving home some of the points that, they're already mentioned by Ricardo, Dunn, and Catherine. So I won't dwell on this too long because I think we're all on the same page. But I'll provide some more context about, our team and how we operated in the past and how that's kind of changed and made us refocus our efforts. And so our team is a collection of 6 to 10 economists, mathematical economists. And in the past, we would go out to the field. We would meet with stakeholders. We would collect the evidence, come to a conclusion, go back to Washington. And sometimes, it wasn't just going to places like Central America. It would be in Asia and other locations. We would finalize our studies and then either travel back to the country and deliver the findings, or we would deliver our findings remotely. And so there was a bit of a disconnect. Now, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't, from time to time, partner with international organizations and local institutions, but we weren't consistent. And so, COVID made us take a step back and to reassess what we were doing and how we were doing it. And we just kind of got, I want to say, a little bit lucky. We had forged, networks through, our offices and our work before, but ACI Voca contacted us about doing this work in Honduras. And, it was kind of a new setup for us, but we all agreed that it was worth pursuing. And, I think it was very successful. And now we're taking a more consistent and proactive approach in pursuing these types of, these partnerships. And so how this worked in Honduras was we partnered with ACI Voca, with the National Autonomous University of Honduras, the Council of Private Enterprises to conduct this study. And so the way it worked was we had members from TMS, from ACI Voca, on the team. UNAH, the National University, had team members who were part of the team as well. And then COHEP helped us kind of navigate the information system. And so, it was truly a collaborative approach. So the research itself was collaborative, but then when we tried to hone in on some of the, the root causes of some of the issues that we identified as constraints to investment, it was absolutely critical. We had local context. They helped us, organize and implement actually TMS pretty much implemented the stakeholder workshop to validate our findings, but then also to figure out what the root causes of some of these issues were. And so it was absolutely critical that we had local actors on the ground to implement that. And as I previously mentioned, partnering with, international organizations as well is critical because they provide expertise and context within their sectors that sometimes, we just don't have. And so I mentioned before our partnership with UC Berkeley's Development Impact Lab, but then also, we worked with the World Bank and with their jobs units to refine and to help implement some of our jobs diagnostic studies. And so, with all that as kind of background, I think I'll just summarize several reasons why I think that, these types of collaborations improve our research and our research products. With that said, what you'll hear here is echoing a lot of what has already been said, so I'll be quick. First, it increases the resources at our disposal. And so what I mean by that is we have, human resources that allow us to kind of scale our studies and to conduct them more efficiently. And then we also have financial resources as well. And of course, that's always needed when you want to collect new data like primary survey data. And also say that it helps us expand the scope of our studies. And I mentioned this before when I talked about the World Bank and ILO. But we are a team of economists who are generalists. We don't focus in a specific area. So it is absolutely critical if we're looking at something like agriculture that we have agronomists and agriculture specialists involved in the study. And so this helps us in that area. Second, it provides local context. I know this was mentioned before, but I think this is absolutely critical for identifying the root cause of issues. And, what I think is that if data without context only tells part of the story, and sometimes that could be half the story, but many times it would be a lot less than that. Third, it makes the data collection process more efficient. And this includes the identification and acquisition of data sets. And it also includes the networks of stakeholders that need to be consulted. And so an example here is, if we purchased a labor force survey from a particular country, and we asked for geolocated data, and they stripped out the PII to the point where we were only able to identify rural versus urban. And so that's with us being international consultants trying to get data, there's sometimes a disconnect, so it helps with that. Fourth, it increases the likelihood that the findings will be put to use, especially if the partners have a strong network and reputation. I know Ricardo mentioned this before, but the networks are invaluable, and knowing what people want and why they want it is absolutely critical to actually having action being taken on particular research. And so, we have our methodologies, we have our ways to go about looking at data, but without having the local context there of why we would look at a particular issue, then there could be a disconnect. Last and probably most importantly, collaborating with the local partners supports local ownership and contributes to the sustainability of research. There are many local researchers who are fully capable of conducting the analysis that we support. This was evident, especially during our growth diagnostic in Honduras. Everything was not new to the experts we worked with. It was just a matter of combining efforts and explaining the methodology. In the long run, they will be the ones who provide the data and evidence that is needed to improve their country's development outcomes. However, before I work myself out of the job or talk myself out of the job, we will continue to work with everyone who's on this panel and others here to provide the research and evidence that's needed by donors to make the decisions they need. So with that, turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nathan. I see in the chat we have another posting by Ricardo Arias of SUBE Latino America. So you may want to check that out as well. But let me follow up in this discussion with Catherine. With all this discussion on data and evidence, and in a time when data is more abundant than ever in many respects, what issues do you see about the quality, transparency, and usability of that data?
Sure. I think, for starters, those of us who work with data from Central America or on Central America are quite familiar with many of the challenges related to the frequency or periodicity of the data, the ease of access, availability, and also whether it's digitized or you need to manually get it into shape. And so I wanted to focus a little bit, on the data that we use to inform development strategies for outcomes like financial inclusion, like small business competitiveness, which has been a large focus for the TMS team in USAID, digital access. A lot of times the data that we need to be able to inform decisions related to those areas is just not granular enough, or it's not current enough to provide insight to answer the research questions that are guiding us. And even, when we do have something, conditions have changed a lot since the onset of the pandemic. Economies have changed, educational access has changed. And in Honduras, after the recent hurricanes, conditions are different and we do need new data. So given all of that, one of the main issues is that without this granular and updated data, we're often relying on data that is available at the macro level, the national level, or at best the departmental level, in a lot of cases in Central America, including Honduras. And when we're relying on aggregate data like this, it only allows us to make assumptions about development strategies that in fact require an approach that is socially or culturally or geographically specific. So if we have aggregate data, that's going to limit the extent to which the evidence and the data that we're basing our decisions on is actually going to lead us to a solution or a plan that's effective. And when there's money involved, it's important to make sure that that the strategies that we're implementing are going to reach what we're hoping. And I think that remittances is one area that's a really good example where the data often doesn't allow us to move from these broad assumptions to inferences, which is where we'd really like to get, because these inferences are going to be based on statistical estimates or more precise quantitative analysis about the role that remittances play in the development process. Oftentimes, we end up having to make assumptions about the relationship between this rising trend in the volume of remittances that are coming into Honduras or other Central American countries, and that translating into better livelihoods. But often what we're lacking is micro level, household, individual, even municipal level data to corroborate the relationship between remittances and that development outcome that we're trying to facilitate, whether it be financial inclusion or asset generation, labor market participation, or issues that are very specific to youth or women or indigenous communities, disabled populations. And that's where I wanted to point to the role that targeted surveys, like the ones that we're implementing, and we've implemented in many other contexts, like the remittance study, because this data is important for kind of filling that gap and helping to complement the official statistics and the macro level data for a few reasons. We're able to be, because of the size of the institutions that are implementing, we're able to be more agile and efficient in implementing the field work. Like Nathan just said, there is the expertise for defining key questions. We're able to get a quick turnaround on analysis. So this data is able to get into the hands of the user more quickly, which is important for those challenges of usability and timeliness and being able to, make a plan based on data that is about the current context and not something that was generated 5 or 10 years ago. So those are, kind of where I'm seeing the data at in the region, especially on remittances, and one of the solutions that I think might help us to fill some of those gaps. I'll turn it back over to you, Charles.
Great, thanks, Catherine. That was very helpful. I see also there's a question in the chat about whether we'll share these slides. The answer is yes. You'll be able to access this slide deck after the panel discussion somewhere on the CADF website. Not sure how that's going to work, but I'm sure there will be instructions available. So finally, let's turn back to Ricardo in the realm of academia. I think it's safe to say that there is growing polarization in the world. I guess increasing intensiveness of different opinions on different things, including in our area of actuation, development assistance in Central America. Can you give us your thoughts on what role academia can and should play in helping to help people with different points of view find common ground and agree on solutions? This is a very high-level question, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how academia can help in that, which is a big challenge here and in many other parts of our lives.
Gracias, Charles. Sí, interesante pregunta, y quisiera agregar que por lo menos en el caso de Honduras, y me atrevería a decir que en la mayor parte de los países de Centroamérica, además de esa polarización, hay una forma de entender los problemas, por lo menos en la esfera política, que creemos que necesita ser cambiado, ¿no? Por lo general, las discusiones suelen estar alrededor de esta idea de qué hizo mal el gobierno, o sea, las autoridades del gobierno, qué es lo que hizo bien pero muy poco, qué es lo que no hizo, etcétera. Hay una visión que los problemas los tiene que resolver solamente el gobierno, y cuando hay discusiones y cuando hay diálogos están en torno a esa visión. Los problemas de Honduras son tan grandes que solo el gobierno no los puede resolver, ¿no? En ese sentido, el primer gran reto, creo, y el primer rol que podemos jugar desde la academia es un cambio de forma de abordar los problemas. Es invitar a todos los actores, ¿no?, de la sociedad a decir: atención, estos problemas son tan grandes que abordarlo de la misma forma, discutirlo de la misma forma, no tienen sentido, no tiene caso seguir discutiéndolo de esa forma. Luego, entonces, el otro tema está en el que, relacionado con el primero, es que los diálogos, cuando hay diálogos, los diálogos, entre comillas, ¿no? Esos diálogos suelen ser esto, es como, ok, nos vamos a poner de acuerdo con unas soluciones y gobierno háganlo, ¿no? Son pliegos de peticiones para que el gobierno lo haga. También relacionado con lo primero, esta nueva forma de abordar los problemas debería de estar orientado, y en este sentido como academia, a construir verdaderos diálogos. Y cuando decimos verdaderos diálogos es sentar a todos los sectores, privado, público, academia, sociedad civil, ¿qué podemos hacer? ¿Cómo podemos contribuir para poder solucionar estos grandes problemas, ¿no? Entender que los grandes problemas no serán, y la cooperación también, ¿no? No me podía faltar este importante actor. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos encontrar estas soluciones? No solamente son responsabilidad del gobierno, sino como el sector privado, los donantes, la sociedad civil, la academia, podemos aportar. En ese sentido, y aquí lo voy a decir como una autocrítica, en América Central, cuando la gente piensa en que las universidades participen, lo miran de dos formas. Uno, publicando artículos, papers, ¿sí?, en revistas, que no los lee la gran mayoría de la población y que por lo tanto no contribuyen, como decía en mi intervención anterior. O dos, saliendo a las calles, a tomarse las calles, a protestar. Y aquí está la universidad protestando. No, o sea, y esa es la visión que tiene la sociedad. Ahí tenemos un reto como universidades para cambiar esta forma de pensar y qué es lo que nosotros podemos hacer. Aquí entonces nosotros proponemos, basada en la experiencia que hemos tenido en esta gran alianza que conversé en las participaciones anteriores, la oportunidad de que surja, ¿no?, la academia como un actor o un interlocutor, un convocante neutral. Las universidades en América Central todavía nos podemos sentirnos orgullosos que no estamos vinculados directamente con un partido político, con un sector particular o con un enfoque particular, etcétera. Eso, y de hecho una reciente encuesta que vamos a publicar en unos cuantos días, aparecen que las universidades, en el caso de Honduras, son las que tienen el mayor nivel de credibilidad a nivel de la sociedad hondureña. Súper interesante, ¿no? Entonces, aprovechar ese papel, ¿no?, esa visión que tiene la universidad, la academia en la sociedad hondureña, para que la universidad pueda ser este interlocutor, este convocante neutral que no tiene ningún interés político o ningún interés económico, ¿no?, de poder participar de los diálogos. La otra gran ventaja que tienen las universidades, que pueden ofrecer las universidades, es este compromiso con la pluralidad de enfoques y de metodologías. Como universidades no estamos obligados a atender un solo enfoque teórico, un solo enfoque metodológico o una sola ideología, ¿no? Eso nos da a nosotros un gran marco de acción y de comprometernos a abordar las temáticas y a invitar a los demás, a invitar al resto de los socios, de los actores, a visualizar esto con una mentalidad mucho más amplia. Y rápidamente, por cuestiones de tiempo, la otra idea aquí entonces importante es que podríamos pensar a partir de esto, y la experiencia nos lo dice, en una ruta hacia una mayor resiliencia. La academia podría, transformándose ella primero, ¿no?, siendo resiliente ella primero, dando el ejemplo, podemos proponer entonces una ruta hacia una mayor resiliencia y colaboración entre todos los actores sociales. Deconstruyamos nuestro pensamiento, nuestro abordaje, ¿sí?, y avancemos hacia otras formas de hacer las cosas de una manera innovadora. Dos ejemplos rápidos. La buena experiencia que tuvimos el año pasado con las encuestas de resiliencia empresarial nos hizo que el Consejo Hondureño de la Empresa Privada nos invitara, ¿no?, a USAID, a Divoca, a la universidad, para que nosotros fuéramos quienes proporcionáramos los datos y las pruebas para poder elaborar la estrategia de empresa sostenible, que es la estrategia del sector empresarial para los próximos 4 años. En el pasado se contrataba una firma consultora, se obtenía financiamiento para que se hiciera todo esto. En este año no se tuvo que hacer así, sino que aprovechando esta alianza se pudieron obtener estos datos, facilitamos los debates para poder interpretar los datos por parte del sector empresarial y diseñamos en tiempo récord y con una fracción del costo financiero y del costo humano que hubiese llevado con otros modelos presentar esta estrategia. La experiencia fue tan buena que nos invitaron a nosotros como universidad a hacer el monitor independiente y tenemos esa responsabilidad de ser el monitor independiente para darle seguimiento a los indicadores de cambio de esa estrategia, ¿no?, y acompañar esa estrategia. Otro ejemplo muy rápido, a partir de esta muy buena experiencia, entonces recibimos la invitación también de cámaras de comercio a nivel de las regiones del país para que elaboremos índices de competitividad regional. ¿Para qué? Para que estos datos, un sinnúmero de indicadores, sirvan de evidencia para elaborar agendas de competitividad regional. Sentarnos, ese es el reto para el próximo año, con los actores de estas regiones y que todos piensen, sector privado, público, academia, sociedad civil, de las regiones del país, alrededor de esa evidencia, tomemos decisiones y compromisos para cambiar la realidad. Creo que esos son ejemplos que nos pueden ayudar en esta dirección.
Great, that's very interesting, Ricardo. I agree with you. I think it's really important that universities adopt a position in all of this that's somewhere between academic publication and protesting in the streets. So something that's actually active and engaged with all of the parties who are involved in discussing these issues. I'm afraid we're down to the last 3 minutes, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative of wrapping this up with some concluding comments. From our perspective as ACDI VOCA working in Honduras, we've seen that certainly the shocks of COVID and the recent hurricanes, for example, among other issues, have really not only required, but also enabled a paradigm shift in the way we work. We really need to collaborate more than we have in the past. And we're seeing that really does pay dividends. We've worked hand in hand with public and private sector partners, joining forces like never before to identify and advance a set of transformations that can overcome all of these challenges that Honduras and communities in Honduras are facing. But we have learned that in order to make this happen, robust evidence and analysis is really necessary. We can't do this in a vacuum of information and data and facts. But on this panel discussion today, we've heard some excellent examples in cases where collaboration and multi-stakeholder partnerships have been the best way to plan, finance, and implement solutions to critical development challenges. I would say the region needs more of this. The way forward, to refer back to the theme of this forum this week, the way forward to heal and rebuild is definitely through alliances, not trying to do things by going it alone. So I really appreciate the comments all of our panelists have made today. I'd like to thank and congratulate all of you, Catherine, Nathan, Ricardo, and Dunn, for joining us.